In 1974, a Venezuelan president walked into his nation's treasury and faced a problem no leader in human history had ever encountered. He had too much money. Carlos Andrés Perez found the central bank literally stacking sacks of US dollars in government hallways because they couldn't build vaults fast enough to store the international reserves pouring into the country. 3,000 miles north, in Miami, Florida, Venezuelan families were earning a nickname that would define an entire era of unprecedented wealth. The merchants and shopkeepers called them the Dame Dos, give me two. Because when these oil-rich Venezuelans bought Italian shoes, they didn't buy one pair. They said, give me two, one for me and one for my friend. When they bought color televisions, which were the marvel of the age, they said, give me two, one for the living room and one for the bathroom. They paid in cash with crisp $100 bills that still smelled of bank vaults. Right now, in 2025, as global energy markets fluctuate and nations scramble for resource security, this story isn't ancient history. It's a warning. Because the same financial system that built Venezuela into Saudi America and then systematically destroyed it is operating today with identical players, identical methods, and identical devastating results. This isn't coincidence. This is design. Today, I'm going to show you the exact mechanism that has trapped oil-rich nations for 50 years running. The same Wall Street banks, the same International Monetary Fund, the same debt instruments, creating the same cycle of boom and collapse. Venezuelan oil money literally built the modern Miami skyline, and the financial patterns that ultimately destroyed Venezuela are being deployed right now against other resource-rich nations around the world. The receipts are public record. The pattern is undeniable. And once you see it operating, you'll understand why no oil boom ever lasts forever, and why the same financial institutions profit massively from both the spectacular rise and the devastating fall. This is the Dame Dos pattern. Same playbook, different century. To understand how Venezuelan oil money built Miami's gleaming towers and simultaneously destroyed an entire nation, we need to start with one man's dark prophecy. Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, the visionary architect of OPEC, drove a small economy car and read by candlelight to save electricity. In 1960, 13 years before the oil crisis that would make Venezuela richer than Switzerland, he made a prediction that would prove devastatingly prophetic. Oil is the devil's excrement. It brings trouble. It brings waste. It brings corruption. But in October 1973, nobody in Venezuela was listening to warnings about the dangers of sudden wealth. The Yom Kippur War had just erupted across the Middle East. Arab oil producers, absolutely furious at Western support for Israel, declared a total oil embargo. They turned off the tap completely. The price of oil didn't just rise, it exploded like a financial bomb. From $3 a barrel to $12 overnight, 400% increase in a matter of weeks. This was the biggest transfer of wealth in human history up to that point. Money flowed like a massive tsunami from the industrial economies of the United States and Europe directly into the coffers of OPEC nations. Venezuela, as a founding member of OPEC, was positioned right at the center of this unprecedented financial hurricane. The man who would captain Venezuela through this incredible windfall was Carlos Andrés Perez, known to absolutely everyone as Cap. He was a charismatic, energetic populist who walked fast, talked even faster, and wore loud plaid jackets that made him instantly recognizable. When he took office in February 1974, he found the Venezuelan treasury literally overflowing with more money than the government could physically store or even count properly. Cap declared that Venezuela would use this massive oil wealth to transform itself into a first-world developed nation within a single decade. He coined the phrase La Gran Venezuela, the Great Venezuela. His vision was absolutely audacious. Nationalize the entire oil industry from American companies like Exxon and Shell. Build a massive steel industry in the Amazon jungle that would rival Pittsburgh. Construct the world's largest hydroelectric dam. And give full scholarships to every single Venezuelan student who wanted to study abroad. The government immediately launched the ambitious Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho scholarship program. Tens of thousands of young Venezuelans, the children of mechanics and maids and taxi drivers, were sent to the most prestigious universities in the United States and Europe, Harvard and Oxford and the Sorbonne, completely free of charge. It was a genuinely noble dream, a massive investment in human capital that was supposed to secure the nation's future for generations. The Venezuelan bolivar was pegged to the US dollar at a rock-solid rate of 430 to 1. You could walk into any bank in Caracas with bolivars and walk out with crisp US dollars. No questions asked, no restrictions, no delays. This monetary stability created what became known as the Dame Dos phenomenon. Wealthy Venezuelans began flying to Miami on shopping sprees that defied all imagination. They bought luxury condos in Brickell and sprawling mansions in Coral Gables without even asking the price. They tipped waiters and hotel staff with $100 bills. Venezuelan families moved through the shopping malls of Florida like conquering armies, buying everything in sight. The whiskey consumption per capita in Venezuela became literally the highest in the entire world. They drank 18-year-old Scotch whiskey like Americans drink water. Caracas became the only city in all of South America where the supersonic Concorde jet landed on a regular schedule. You could fly from Paris to Caracas in just 3 hours, arriving in time for a champagne lunch at expensive French restaurants that served Maine lobster flown in fresh that very morning. But behind this spectacular facade of prosperity, a mathematical trap was being systematically constructed with cold precision. The same oil money that funded the incredible shopping sprees in Miami was creating a fatal economic dependency through what economists call Dutch disease. When a country gets a massive influx of foreign currency, like dollars from oil exports, it makes the local currency so strong that it becomes incredibly cheap to import everything from abroad, and incredibly expensive to produce anything domestically. Venezuelan farmers suddenly couldn't compete with Iowa corn farmers. Venezuelan shoe factories couldn't compete with Italian designers. The entire productive apparatus of the nation began to die a slow death. Agriculture collapsed across the country. Manufacturing industries withered and disappeared. Venezuela stopped making things and started buying everything from other countries. They imported food, clothes, cars, machinery, even sand to build concrete skyscrapers, because apparently Venezuelan sand wasn't considered good enough. This was the first part of the trap that was being constructed: complete addiction to imports. But the second part of the trap was far more dangerous and would prove absolutely fatal. It was the debt. Here's where this story becomes truly diabolical, because the debt trap that eventually destroyed Venezuela wasn't some accident of economic policy. It was a carefully engineered system designed by the very same Wall Street banks that are operating with identical methods today. You might reasonably wonder why a country that was literally swimming in cash would need to borrow money from foreign banks. This is the great paradox that reveals the true predatory nature of the international financial system. The massive oil money that was flooding into Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and other OPEC nations had to go somewhere. These countries simply couldn't spend $15 billion fast enough, even with their ambitious development projects and lavish spending. So they deposited this money in what they considered the safest place they knew: the major banks of Wall Street in London, institutions like Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Bank of America. These American banks were suddenly sitting on absolutely enormous mountains of cash, deposited by the oil-rich nations. But here's the fundamental thing about banking. Banks don't make money by simply holding cash in their vaults. They make money by lending that cash out to borrowers and collecting interest. These banks desperately needed to find someone, anyone, who would borrow these billions of dollars. But the United States economy in 1974 was stuck in a deep recession with high inflation. American businesses were struggling and definitely weren't borrowing money for expansion. So these banks looked south, toward Latin America, where they found extremely eager customers in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and especially Venezuela. The bankers arrived in Caracas with big smiles and expensive briefcases, offering loan terms that seemed almost too good to be true. They offered variable interest rates that started incredibly low, sometimes actually below the rate of inflation, which meant Venezuela was effectively being paid to borrow money. The bankers explained very reassuringly that these low rates were just temporary, just until global economic conditions stabilized. Venezuelan government officials, completely drunk on oil revenues and absolutely convinced that oil prices would stay high forever, eagerly signed loan agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This money was supposed to fund CAP's incredibly ambitious Great Venezuela project: the massive steel mills, the aluminum smelters, the enormous infrastructure projects that would completely modernize the nation and transform it into a developed economy. But here's what the Venezuelan government officials didn't fully understand, and what the banks were very careful not to emphasize. These weren't traditional fixed-rate loans, like a home mortgage. These were floating-rate loans tied directly to something called the London Interbank Offered Rate, or LIBOR. When LIBOR moved up, Venezuela's debt payments moved up automatically with it. And LIBOR was controlled by the exact same banks that were making these loans to Venezuela in the first place. The banks marketed this arrangement extremely aggressively. Walter Wriston, who was chairman of Citibank at the time, famously declared that countries don't go bankrupt. The implication was crystal clear. Lending money to sovereign nations that were backed by massive oil reserves was literally the safest investment opportunity in the entire world. Citibank alone made over $1.2 billion in loans to Venezuela between 1974 and 1978. Chase Manhattan Bank, which was led by David Rockefeller himself, competed absolutely fiercely for Venezuelan business. Bank of America opened multiple offices throughout Caracas. These weren't just casual business relationships. They were carefully planned strategic partnerships, specifically designed to capture an entire nation's oil wealth and systematically redirect it through the Wall Street financial system. The fundamental mechanism was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effect. Venezuela would export oil and receive US dollars for it. But instead of keeping those dollars in Venezuelan banks, where they would benefit the Venezuelan economy, the government deposited them in New York banks, where they earned modest interest rates. Then, Venezuela would borrow those exact same dollars back from those exact same banks, paying much higher interest rates for the privilege of accessing their own money. This created what economists call capital flight. Venezuelan wealth was literally flowing out of the country into Wall Street bank vaults, even as Venezuelan debt was flowing back into the country. The banks collected substantial fees on both sides of every single transaction. They collected deposit fees, loan origination fees, restructuring fees, and most importantly, interest rate spreads that generated billions of dollars in profits. By 1978, Venezuela's total foreign debt had grown from virtually zero to over $15 billion. But oil prices were still high, and the debt payments were still manageable. The trap hadn't snapped shut quite yet. The absolute genius of this system was that it created a powerful illusion of prosperity and development while systematically undermining the foundation of that prosperity. The cheap imports that were funded by borrowed dollars were steadily destroying Venezuelan industry. The government, which was flush with oil revenues and loan proceeds, had absolutely no incentive to develop non-oil sectors of the economy. Why invest in agriculture when you could simply import food? Why build factories when you could import manufactured goods? What looked like impressive economic development was actually economic dependence. Venezuela was being systematically transformed from a diversified economy into a single product export machine that was specifically designed to service foreign debt. The banks knew this perfectly well. Their internal memos from this period, which were revealed years later through congressional investigations, show that they understood exactly what they were creating. Permanent client states that would be completely dependent on continued lending to maintain their standard of living. This pattern had been tested and perfected before in other contexts. The same Wall Street banks had used virtually identical strategies in pre-war Germany, funding the Weimar Republic's debt-driven expansion in the 1920s, then systematically calling in those debts during the Great Depression. They had perfected similar techniques with railroad bonds in the 19th century, funding massive infrastructure projects across Latin America, then seizing control of the railroads when countries inevitably couldn't pay. But Venezuela in the 1970s represented the absolute perfection of this model. Never before had a single country been so systematically integrated into the Wall Street financial system while still maintaining the complete illusion of sovereignty and prosperity. Same playbook, different century. In 1979, everything changed completely and devastatingly. Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve with a single-minded mission. Inflation in the United States was spiraling completely out of control, approaching 15% annually and threatening to destroy the American economy. Volcker made a dramatic decision that would reshape the entire global financial system and ultimately destroy Venezuela in the process. He would raise interest rates to absolutely whatever level was necessary to completely kill inflation, regardless of the international consequences. This is where the floating rate loan trap revealed its true and devastating cruelty. Remember, Venezuela's massive debt was tied directly to LIBOR, which moved automatically with US interest rates. When Volcker began systematically raising rates, Venezuela's debt payments didn't just increase gradually, they absolutely exploded. In 1978, Venezuela was paying approximately 4% interest on its foreign debt, which was manageable given the high oil revenues. But by 1981, that interest rate had skyrocketed to 18%. On $15 billion of total debt, this meant that Venezuela's annual interest payments alone jumped from $600 million to $2.7 billion. In just 3 years, the debt service had increased by over 300%, while oil revenues remained essentially flat. But here's the truly diabolical part of this entire scheme. The exact same banks that had actively encouraged Venezuela to borrow money at low rates were now profiting enormously from the artificially high rates. Citibank's quarterly reports from this period show massive increases in international lending profits, driven almost entirely by higher interest rates on existing loans to countries like Venezuela. The banks had engineered what can only be described as the perfect financial trap. They had aggressively lent money when rates were historically low, deliberately locking countries into variable rate agreements that seemed favorable at the time. Then, through their extensive influence on monetary policy and their direct control of benchmark rates like LIBOR, they had systematically engineered a situation where their own profits would skyrocket, while their borrowers would be completely crushed. Luis Herrera Campins, who succeeded Cap as president in 1979, suddenly found himself in a completely impossible situation. Venezuela's oil revenues were no longer anywhere near sufficient to cover the exploding debt payments, let alone fund normal government operations. The country that had been literally swimming in cash just 5 years earlier was now desperately borrowing money just to pay the interest on money it had already borrowed. This is when the second wave of predatory lending began in earnest. The major banks, led by Chase Manhattan and Citibank, offered what they called bridge loans and debt restructuring packages. They explained very reassuringly that this was just temporary assistance while oil prices recovered to their previous levels. But these new loans came with even higher interest rates and much shorter maturities. Venezuela was being systematically pushed deeper and deeper into financial quicksand with each attempted rescue. The psychological effect on Venezuelan society was absolutely devastating. The famous Dame Dos shopping sprees in Miami began to slow down noticeably. The regular Concorde flights became less and less frequent. The Venezuelan government was forced to implement currency exchange controls for the first time since the 1940s. Ordinary Venezuelans could no longer freely convert their bolivars to US dollars. But the banks weren't anywhere near finished with their systematic extraction. They introduced sophisticated new financial instruments that were specifically designed to extract maximum profit from Venezuela's growing distress. Currency swaps, interest rate hedges, and commodity-linked loans all carried substantial hidden fees and complex risks that Venezuelan government officials who lacked sophisticated financial expertise didn't fully understand or appreciate. Chase Manhattan Bank alone made over $400 million in fees and interest payments from Venezuelan operations between 1979 and 1982. This wasn't money that was being lent to Venezuela for development. This was money that was being systematically extracted from Venezuela for the privilege of being trapped in an impossible debt situation. The pattern was now becoming crystal clear, and it definitely wasn't limited to Venezuela alone. Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and other Latin American countries that had borrowed heavily during the petrodollar boom were all experiencing the exact same crushing debt spiral. The entire region was being systematically stripped of wealth through the same floating rate loan mechanism that was destroying Venezuela. By 1982, Venezuela's total foreign debt had exploded to over $30 billion. The country was now spending approximately 60% of its total export earnings just to service existing debt, leaving almost nothing available for domestic investment, social programs, or economic development. The oil wealth that was supposed to build the Great Venezuela was flowing directly and continuously to Wall Street bank accounts. The banks knew exactly what they were doing. Internal documents from this period, which were revealed years later through congressional investigations, show that major American banks were actively coordinating their lending strategies specifically to maximize profits from the developing crisis. They would collectively reduce lending to force countries into financial distress, then offer rescue packages at much higher interest rates. This was the exact same playbook that had been used during the Great Depression, when Wall Street banks had first encouraged wild speculation with easy credit, then systematically called in loans to trigger the crash, then bought up distressed assets at fire sale prices. The financial technology and instruments had evolved and become more sophisticated, but the fundamental predatory strategy remained completely unchanged. The pattern was now complete, but the human suffering was just beginning. By 1988, Venezuela was facing complete and total financial collapse. The man who had presided over the incredible oil boom, Carlos Andrés Pérez, made the decision to run for president again. He campaigned almost entirely on pure nostalgia, constantly reminding people of the golden times when wealthy Venezuelans bought Miami condos with suitcases full of cash, and everyone felt rich and powerful. The absolutely desperate population, clinging to memories of prosperity, believed his promises and voted him back into office in a massive landslide. But when Cap returned to the presidential palace in February 1989, he made a shocking discovery. The cupboard was completely bare. Venezuela's international reserves were effectively zero. The country couldn't meet its basic debt obligations, or even import essential necessities like food and medicine. He had absolutely no choice but to turn to the so-called lender of last resort, the International Monetary Fund. This is where the final and most devastating phase of the financial trap revealed itself completely. The IMF wasn't some neutral international rescue organization. It was essentially an enforcement arm of the exact same banking system that had systematically created the crisis in the first place. The IMF's largest shareholders and controlling votes belonged to the United States, Britain, Germany, and Japan, the exact same countries whose major banks held enormous amounts of Venezuelan debt. The IMF offered Venezuela what appeared to be a lifeline, a bailout package worth $4.5 billion. But this definitely wasn't charity or humanitarian assistance. The loan came with an extremely structural adjustment program that was euphemistically called el paquete, the package. These conditions were specifically designed not to help Venezuela recover economically, but to absolutely ensure that foreign creditors would be fully repaid. The IMF's demands were harsh and comprehensive. They required that Venezuela immediately lift all price controls on basic consumer goods, privatize profitable state-owned companies, completely eliminate import restrictions, and, most explosively of all, remove government subsidies on gasoline. For ordinary Venezuelans, cheap gasoline was considered an absolute birthright. It was the one tangible benefit they received from living in an oil-rich nation. Gasoline literally costs less than bottled water. Raising gasoline prices was considered political suicide, the absolute third rail of Venezuelan politics. But Carlos Andrés Pérez, who was now completely trapped by the massive debt burden and the demands of international bankers, reluctantly agreed to every single condition. He announced the comprehensive austerity package on national television, grimly telling the Venezuelan people that these painful sacrifices were absolutely necessary for the country's economic future. On February 27, 1989, the dramatic new prices officially went into effect across the country. The reaction was immediate, explosive, and absolutely devastating. The price of gasoline doubled overnight without warning. Bus fares and transportation costs increased proportionally across the board. People who lived in the sprawling hillside slums around Caracas woke up that morning to discover that they could no longer afford basic transportation to their jobs in the city center. What started as small, localized protests in suburban towns very quickly spread to the capital city like wildfire. For 3 consecutive days, the city of Caracas burned in uncontrolled riots. The uprising, which became known throughout Venezuela as El Caracazo, saw thousands upon thousands of desperate people descending from the impoverished slums into the wealthy commercial districts of the city. But this wasn't organized political protest or peaceful demonstration. This was pure, uncontrolled rage and desperation. People systematically looted supermarkets, electronics stores, and shopping malls. They were literally taking back the symbols of prosperity and consumption that had been systematically stripped away from them. The government's response was swift, brutal, and absolutely devastating. Carlos Andrés Pérez, the same man who had once been considered the hero and champion of the Venezuelan people, made the decision to suspend all constitutional rights and send the national army into the streets with explicit orders to shoot to kill. Soldiers armed with automatic weapons systematically fired into crowds of protesters and into the densely populated slums where the poor lived. The official government death toll was listed as around 300 people, but independent human rights organizations estimated that several thousand people may have actually died. Many bodies were buried hastily in unmarked mass graves. The Caracazo completely and permanently destroyed the legitimacy of Venezuela's democratic political system and created the crucial political opening that would eventually allow Hugo Chavez to rise to power. But more importantly for understanding the broader economic pattern, it clearly demonstrated the true function of IMF structural adjustment programs. These programs weren't actually designed to restore genuine economic stability and growth. They were specifically designed to ensure debt collection and wealth extraction at absolutely any human cost. This exact same pattern had played out systematically across Latin America throughout the 1980s, which economists now refer to as the lost decade. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, every single country that had borrowed heavily during the petrodollar boom was eventually forced to implement virtually identical, harsh austerity programs. The result was always exactly the same: complete economic collapse, widespread social unrest, political instability, and the systematic transfer of national wealth to foreign creditors and financial institutions. The psychological and social impact on Venezuelan society absolutely cannot be overstated. An entire generation of people who had grown up believing that their country was destined for greatness and prosperity suddenly faced the harsh reality that they had been systematically robbed and betrayed. The massive oil wealth that should have been used to build world-class hospitals, schools, and infrastructure had instead been used to build gleaming Manhattan bank towers and finance Wall Street profits. When Hugo Chavez launched his dramatic but ultimately failed coup attempt in 1992, he wasn't just rebelling against the Venezuelan government and political establishment. He was fundamentally rebelling against the entire system of international financial dependency that had systematically destroyed his country and impoverished its people. His revolutionary message resonated so powerfully because it directly addressed the lived experience of millions of Venezuelans who had personally watched their nation's oil wealth systematically disappear into foreign bank vaults. The pattern was now completely finished, but the devastating consequences would last for decades to come. Right now, in 2025, the exact same financial mechanisms that systematically destroyed Venezuela are being actively deployed against resource-rich nations around the world. The key players have evolved, and the specific financial instruments have become more technologically sophisticated, but the fundamental underlying pattern remains completely unchanged. Create economic dependency through strategic debt arrangements, then systematically extract wealth through manufactured financial crises. Look carefully at what's happening right now with African oil producers. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Ghana have all borrowed extremely heavily against their future oil revenues through complex financial instruments called pre-export financing facilities. These are essentially the modern, more sophisticated version of the floating rate loans that systematically trapped Venezuela 40 years ago. These countries receive substantial cash payments up front in exchange for legally committing their future oil production to foreign creditors and financial institutions. The exact same Wall Street banks are heavily involved in these operations. JP Chase, which is the direct successor to Chase Manhattan Bank, has arranged over $12 billion in pre-export financing deals for African oil producers since 2020. Citigroup has facilitated another $8 billion in similar arrangements. Goldman Sachs has created extremely complex derivative structures that allow these major banks to profit enormously from oil price volatility, while the producing countries bear absolutely all of the financial risk. The underlying mechanism is essentially identical to what systematically destroyed Venezuela. When oil prices are high and global demand is strong, these countries appear economically prosperous and can easily service their debt obligations. But these loan agreements are carefully structured with variable interest rates and commodity price triggers built directly into them. When oil prices inevitably fall, or when interest rates rise significantly, the debt payments explode exponentially, exactly as they did for Venezuela in the 1980s. Consider Nigeria's devastating experience over just the past 5 years. The country borrowed extremely heavily against its oil revenues when crude oil was trading well above $100 per barrel, and the future looked bright. But when global oil prices collapsed dramatically during the COVID pandemic, Nigeria's debt service payments jumped from a manageable 12% of total government revenues to an absolutely crushing 90%. The country has been forced to devalue its currency repeatedly, creating massive inflation that has pushed millions of ordinary Nigerians into desperate poverty. The Chinese government has also systematically adopted this proven model through its massive Belt and Road Initiative. Countries like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and several African nations have borrowed extremely heavily to finance Chinese-built infrastructure projects like ports, railways, and power plants. When these countries inevitably struggle to repay these enormous loans, China systematically seizes control of strategic assets. Sri Lanka's crucial Hambantota port, Pakistan's strategically important Gwadar port, and Djibouti's main commercial port are all now effectively controlled by Chinese state enterprises after complex debt-for-equity swap arrangements. But perhaps the most sophisticated version of this wealth extraction system operates through what economists call the financialization of basic commodities. Today's resource extraction isn't simply about selling oil or minerals on international markets. It's about creating extremely complex financial instruments based on those resources that generate enormous profits for Wall Street institutions far beyond the actual value of the underlying commodities themselves. Goldman Sachs, for example, has created elaborate aluminum warehousing schemes that artificially inflate global aluminum prices while generating hundreds of millions of dollars in profits for the bank. JP Morgan has implemented similar market manipulation strategies with copper and other essential industrial metals. These sophisticated financial manipulations systematically increase costs for manufacturers and consumers worldwide, while extracting genuine wealth from the real economy into speculative financial markets. Even the technology sector has created its own sophisticated version of resource extraction through what development economists call data colonialism. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon systematically extract massive value from user data that is generated in developing countries, but virtually all of the profits from this data extraction flow directly to Silicon Valley and other developed financial centers. This creates exactly the same dependency relationship that oil exports created for Venezuela. Countries provide valuable raw materials, while the value-added processing and wealth accumulation happen elsewhere. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund continue to play their traditional role as enforcers and legitimizers of this systematic extraction system. Their so-called development programs consistently push developing countries toward export-oriented economies that are completely dependent on volatile commodity prices and foreign investment flows. When these countries inevitably face financial crises, these same international institutions offer bailout packages with harsh conditions that ensure continued dependency and wealth extraction. Even the much-celebrated green energy transition is being systematically structured to maintain and reinforce these extractive patterns. Lithium extraction in Bolivia, cobalt mining in Congo, and rare earth mineral production in various African countries are all being financed through the exact same debt mechanisms that originally trapped Venezuela. The developing countries provide essential raw materials, while the high-value technology development and manufacturing that create real economic value continue to happen primarily in already developed nations. According to careful calculations by development economist Jason Hickel, developing countries currently transfer over $3 trillion annually to developed countries through debt service payments, corporate tax avoidance, and deliberate trade mispricing schemes. This massive wealth transfer is more than 20 times larger than the total amount of foreign aid flowing in the opposite direction. The system has become more complex, more global in scope, and more technologically sophisticated in its extraction mechanisms. But the fundamental pattern remains exactly the same. Promise prosperity and development through resource wealth. Systematically create economic dependency through carefully structured debt arrangements. Then extract maximum value through financial manipulation and manufactured crises. You cannot escape the system, but you can understand it. The Dom-DOS pattern isn't just fascinating historical curiosity, it's an active blueprint being systematically deployed right now against the next generation of resource-rich developing nations. And the warning signs are absolutely everywhere if you understand how to read them properly. Watch very carefully what happens as the global green energy transition continues to accelerate. Countries that are rich in lithium, cobalt, and rare earth minerals are experiencing the exact same sudden wealth influx that Venezuela experienced in the 1970s. Bolivia's massive lithium reserves, Congo's extensive cobalt deposits, and Mongolia's rare earth mountains are generating the exact same kind of intense international banking interest that Venezuelan oil once generated. The loan agreements being signed today contain the exact same variable interest rate structures, the same commodity price triggers, and the same systematic debt trap mechanisms that ultimately destroyed Venezuela. The Democratic Republic of Congo has already borrowed over $6 billion against its future cobalt production. Bolivia has legally committed its lithium reserves to Chinese and American creditors for the next 30 years. When the inevitable commodity price crash eventually comes, and historical experience shows it always does, these countries will face the exact same impossible debt spiral that Venezuela experienced. The crucial difference is that this time, the stakes are genuinely global. These materials are absolutely essential for electric vehicles, solar panels, and wind turbines. Control over these critical supply chains means effective control over the entire global green energy infrastructure. The financial institutions orchestrating this new wave of resource extraction have learned important lessons from Venezuela's experience. They have developed much more sophisticated instruments to capture value and manage their own risk exposure. Blockchain-based commodity tokens, carbon credit derivatives, and ESG-linked bonds all serve the exact same fundamental function as the petrodollar recycling of the 1970s, but with 21st century technological complexity. Climate change itself is being systematically financialized through carbon markets and green bonds that create entirely new opportunities for speculation and wealth extraction. Countries facing devastating climate disasters are being offered resilience bonds and catastrophe derivatives that follow the exact same debt dependency model that originally trapped Venezuela. The pattern is accelerating rapidly, the scale is much larger than before, and the potential consequences are far more severe. Because this time, it's not just about one country's oil wealth, it's about the entire planet's transition to sustainable energy. And whether that crucial transition will ultimately serve genuine human needs or simply generate financial profits for the same institutions. If this video opened your eyes to the Dame-Das pattern, if you can now clearly see how Venezuelan oil money built Miami's skyline while simultaneously destroying an entire nation, if you understand exactly how the same Wall Street banks systematically engineered both the spectacular prosperity and the devastating collapse, then subscribe to Economic Rewind immediately. Because this is just the beginning of the story. Next week, I'll show you how the exact same wealth extraction patterns are being actively used right now to systematically drain lithium-rich South American countries, and how the global green energy transition is rapidly becoming the next great international resource extraction scheme. The banks and financial institutions have evolved and become more sophisticated, but the fundamental playbook remains completely identical. The pattern connecting Venezuelan oil wealth, Miami real estate development, Wall Street loan arrangements, and modern international resource extraction isn't coincidence or accident. It's deliberate design. The same financial families, the same institutional structures, the same fundamental mechanisms of international financial control operating systematically across decades and continents. Once you start seeing these patterns clearly, you absolutely can't unsee them. The Dame-Dos weren't just extravagant shopping sprees. They were the visible symptom of a systematic transfer of wealth from the global south directly to Wall Street financial centers. The gleaming Miami skyline that was built with Venezuelan oil money stands today as a permanent monument to financial imperialism disguised as free market capitalism. This is Economic Rewind, where we systematically uncover the financial patterns that shaped history and are actively shaping your future right now. Hit subscribe because this system operates continuously, whether you understand it or not. But understanding it changes absolutely everything. The receipts are public record. The pattern is undeniable.